Hey, good afternoon. This is Ricky Riley from Traditions Training, and we're here on the Fire Engineering Humpday Hangout. And today we've got quite the distinguished panel on here today to discuss the training topic. We have Chief Heller, Tony Carroll. I almost said Tony Kelleher. Sorry, Tony. Too many Tonys. Sam Hiddle, Larry Schultz, Scott Kraut, and myself, Ricky Riley, and Dan Shaw. We might be chiming in every once in a while. So. The topic today is we're going to talk about some training, but I just want to get two things out real quick from us at Traditions Training and the International Society of Fire Service Instructors. Today is an anniversary of the line of duty death of Lieutenant McRae of the Washington, D.C. Fire Department this day in 2015. He lost his life in a high-rise fire in D.C. Fire Department. And then the other piece is I've been in communication this week with our friends in Bedford County, Virginia. They had a dwelling fire. They ended up having a mayday with an unconscious firefighter and sent 3 or 4 firefighters to the hospital. I was in contact with them at the beginning of the week, and it looks like those members are going to recover, but obviously it was a pretty tragic event. So not tragic, I mean, it's just bad all the way around finding an unconscious firefighter. So I just want to give a shout out to them. I hope all the members are going to be okay and everything's all right down there. So, Chief Schultz, why don't you kind of explain what we got going on here today? This is your and Sammy's idea, and then we'll go from there.
All right, just to be clear, this was Sammy Hiddle alone. He's just dragging everybody else along for the ride here. So, although every now and then Sammy comes up with a cogent idea that's actually very limited in scope. It's not broad and complex, but it actually is a really, really good idea. So I think we'll have some fun with it today. And I'm looking at those mugs on the screen, and I think the people that are on the call are going to contribute a lot to the topic. So it's an interesting topic. It really is about knowledge management. And I know that's not a term we use in the fire department a lot, but it really is a discussion that we'll talk about in a lot of different ways, how we should be training our people. What are the concepts, most importantly, of passing that information on to younger firefighters? And then we'll talk about the differences between really the pluses and minuses of hands-on training versus book level training. So that's really what we're going to get into. And considering a lot of the things we've been talking about, this really would have been a good one to start the blog off several weeks ago when we started. So I think we'll kind of get it out of the way now, but it's good. It's good information to think about. So again, when I talk about knowledge management, I figured I'd just start off by talking about 3 primary means of knowledge that we gain knowledge with training in the fire department. The first is explicit knowledge. And basically explicit knowledge is what you're getting every time you open a book, read a manual, look at a set of SOPs. It's really kind of written down on paper. You can read it, understand it, and it gives you a base set of knowledge, right? So when you get into those debates about the importance of knowledge and experience, that's where this conversation is going to go back and forth. So explicit knowledge, it's written, it's what you read, it's what you understand. The second form is implicit knowledge. And implicit knowledge is really where you can begin to take that explicit knowledge and start to put it to practical use. So as an example, I'll play it out here. Explicit knowledge would be reading our SOG manuals. When we get into implicit knowledge, that's where we're putting those scenarios up on video, and we're starting to talk about the application of the written SOGs. And so you're sitting around with a group of mutts like us, and we put a scenario in, and based on the various experiences that Aaron and Ricky and Scott and Shaw and Scott Kraut and Tony Carroll and Sammy Hiddle have, we began to talk through what we see individually based on our experiences, based on where we work, based on our procedures, tools, and equipment. We begin to make sense of it, and we get into these interesting back and forth discussions about what the most appropriate tactics are. Within that implicit knowledge is something that I know we have talked a lot about, which is intuitive or tacit knowledge. And we primarily use that type of, this is a knowledge that comes from experience. And sometimes when we talk about tacit knowledge, we don't even really know how to communicate that information. You just kind of get a gut instinct, right? That's intuitive or tacit knowledge. A lot of time from the command level, this is what's happening when we're sitting out front looking at a building and we hear a transmission and something just doesn't sit right with the transmission. It starts to say, hey, something's not right with this, or we're looking at a building and it's not behaving appropriately. It's this intuitive type knowledge that comes from experience and just allows you to be able to make decisions. And if somebody were to ask you to explain, you wouldn't be able to do it. So how does that really, build into today's conversation? The first is this. In the fire service, folks, if we've got to think through every situation on the fire ground, we're going to be in big trouble. If we've got to sit and dissect everything and try to make sense of it before we decide, we're going to be in big trouble. This is where we need to use other forms of information management, like hands-on experience, the value of practical application, the ability to sit in a room with a group of people like this and have discussion and debate and dialogue. So that's kind of the premise of what we'll kind of walk around the horn, or Ricky will walk us around the horn today and try to see if we can't make some sense of a pretty complicated process of managing information that we learn on the job. Back to you, Rick.
Sorry, I had myself muted. So the first person we're going to go to, we got to go to a company officer now and let the company officer see what his perspective is on it. Mr. Mustache.
It really comes down to what the chief already expressed, where we're trying to build some intuition, and intuition is often based on experience. There's two sides to that. If we don't have experience, then we're going to have to create experiences through training, but we have to be real diligent in the training we do, because we can create bad experiences that have successful outcomes and create a negative intuition that could get guys jammed up down the road. When we go back to the explicit knowledge piece, we're talking about expertise. These are people that understand a concept so well that they can actually convey it in written form, and they can give you the nuts and bolts of why you're doing it. Whereas the implicit piece is just understanding that it works, so that when you go into a stressful situation, you will recall a situation or apply a dynamic that you've experienced to find that successful outcome. One of the things that I like to do when we train to try to build that is several things. One, I want them to experience something that's successful, and then I want them to experience a failure or something to a less degree. So to give you an example, we got a cable hoist a couple weeks ago. So we had everybody hook this cable hoist up and drag my Jeep across the app bay floor. Now we made everybody go through the entire process. Nobody could help you of hooking this thing up and then drag it at a 1-to-1 ratio. Then we had them hook it up and change it to a 4-to-1 ratio and drag the Jeep. And what that does is that gives a mental imprint of, I may not understand the dynamics, the diameter of the rope. I may not understand how the mechanical advantage of the drum on the hoist work in relation to the rope, I may not understand exactly how much leverage I'm getting when I extend that handle. However, I do understand that this did not work when I did it this way, and it worked when I did it that way. And so when you get in that stressful situation, you're likely to resort back to what worked. I would say that the other thing is we've got to be careful also when we train that we don't build mechanical habits. We're trying to instill some of that intuition. So when we were doing some heavy rigging, again, each person had to set up the heavy rigging on their own, but I never allowed the same situation to be played out because we wanted them to think through the process. If we continue to train on the exact same thing over and over without changing our buildings when we're stretching lines, then what we build is mechanical habits rather than that implicit knowledge of how to overcome problems.
Are you done with your thoughts?
Yeah.
I feel like you need to say stop, Sammy, because it's like you got something else ready to come out, at any second. So we went from Chief Schultz to a company officer. So we'll go back to another chief and go to Chief Heller. And before we get to Scott Crowd, who's a company officer, just once again to get a different set of views on this. So Chief Heller, it's all you.
Hi guys, thanks for having me back. It's tough because again we look at how people learn and how we convey it the best, and I really think that as I've grown older in the fire service, the tacit knowledge obviously has built up over the years of experience, and it is difficult to get that across at times. I like what Sam said because if we I don't want to create robots in training. Anybody, I watched my son who's a college student, and they read a book or they do what they have to do and they Google everything and they regurgitate it and they get through the class basically. And those are the kids who are coming into the fire service today. They have been taught how to regurgitate what you just took in, spit it back out, and I get a good grade. Where in our job, it just doesn't work that way because of the need to think outside the box. And I agree that originally with the explicit training, with the explicit knowledge, with the SOPs and the Firefighter 1 manuals and our Proby books, they need that base, obviously. But from there, I agree with Sam that we have to mix this up, and that's how we get it to the masses, and they have the ability to react on their own, and we're not just creating these robots, so to speak. I think that's really important for us. And again, because of the new age and because of the way that kids can learn and all the opportunity, not just kids, but all of us can learn, and all the opportunity that's out there, I just find that it makes more sense. We have to challenge them, but we have to give them really, really good foundations. And then the feedback to us is something to process, which I've seen more and more now sitting in the chief's office than I ever saw just as the company officer. I think that I'm seeing some young guys show up with some ideas, and I have to be able to digest them. And I go with the fact that I have more tacit knowledge than they do. Where do I feel about that? How do I feel about that? If that makes any sense. But I really do agree that the challenges, the changes, the fact that I don't want robots working for me, and I don't want chiefs as robots just checking boxes at a command post as well, because I've seen that just as badly through my time as a company officer. So that's kind of where I am, Rick.
Aaron, I would just caution you not to agree with Sam Hill too much in one day.
All right. All right, that we need to write that one down too. That's a statement of all statements. So I'm going to go back to another company officer. I just want to kind of back and forth, and then we'll get to Chief Carroll and then to Dan. He was a chief that wanted to be a company officer again. But so Scott Kraut, can you drive and talk at the same time?
I can. You hear me okay?
Yeah, just as long as you don't
Yeah.
agree with Sam, I think you're going to be in a good spot with Chief Schultz. So.
Well, I was going to start off with what's that rigging stuff he was talking about? Is that fire department related or dragging Jeeps across the floor? Is that something we do? I don't know.
He's a big
Maybe it's
rescue squad guy now.
Must be a rescue squad thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think, you know, both everybody's on the same page here, and you know, to Chief Heller's point, the robots. You know, I kind of break it down in the same meaning, but I use it like principle versus protocol. You know, and we have to have protocol training, obviously, because there are certain guidelines that we have to follow. But you know, my concern is what happens when the protocol doesn't match, you know, the environment. So you've got, you know, X, Y, and Z, and this is supposed to happen, and that's supposed to happen. But as we know, that calamity of errors that Chief Shaw talks about, you know, when something doesn't go right, we need to have a play in the playbook that we can revert to. And to Sam's point, or maybe it was Chief Schultz, you don't want to have to think about it a lot. So, you know, one of the principles to the training that we've done for a long time now is, you know, if you look at implicit training and think about the end goal and just how do you get to the end goal. So I don't care how you do it, you know, but drag the Jeep across the floor, you know, and drag the Jeep across the floor the most efficient way, you know, and X, Y, Z will get you there. So, you know, you have to have that protocol piece to it, I guess, you know, the crawl, walk, run, and now they say fly piece to all the training is that, you know, if they have the solid foundation, then typically an intelligent individual can then work out the facts, you know, in a stressful situation. So trying to give the newest member all the pieces of the puzzle, then, okay, what do you do when X doesn't happen? What's an option for you? When we talk about, you know, 3 seconds or 4 seconds, you know, if that's not working, then move on to your plan Z. And, you know, to what some of you were saying about, you know, the practice is like Sammy was saying, that, you know, it's got to be perfect practice. And you can make mistakes in training, and we always do, and we make mistakes on the fire ground as well. But the key is to not let that go by. And when you talk about the tacit training and the ability to build that knowledge base, and I'll use the Oak Street fire we had recently that I think you can see from Mars. You know, and I don't know all the particulars, but I will say, and this isn't a negative, it's just a system and the way it is that engine officer had about 2 days in the seat. And so what you end up with, in my opinion, this is strictly my opinion, is that the chauffeur had a play he was going to call, right? And so he dictated the hydrant that they were going to take, because the officer either, you know, may have been overwhelmed or whatever. And so what you have is a junior member, so to speak, or that's going off of a residential tactic or a residential interior tactic that I got water, okay, everything is good. Meanwhile, we didn't think through the process. We didn't say, oh, this fire is probably going to get away from us if we don't slow it down just a minute, think about what tactic we're going to use, or what's the strategy, and then what tactic we're going to use to get it on. And I'm not saying that, you know, a few extra seconds to stretch across Route 1 to a bigger water main, and a few extra seconds to get a master streaming service quickly would have stopped that thing, but you certainly would have given it hell for a few minutes. So, yeah, I really think we have to, you know, we can't discount implicit or explicit training, or the knowledge base. You just got to find the right place to insert it. That's into my thoughts.
All right, I got that, Scott. And that kind of drives a question that Tony, Carol, I hope I'm going to ask the question, and I think I know that you'll be able to answer it. But so I meant, obviously the DC Fire Department is probably one of the most strict SOP driven departments in the country. So how does all this knowledge work with the SOPs? Is that a fair question to you, or?
Yeah, it's a fair question,
Okay.
And I will. I have to, where we're struggling, very struggling as far as what the goal is for the SOGs and where we what's our balance. But let me start with I think I've seen this over the years, and a lot of times we have we're very good. We're very good at our SOGs, and that's kind of where it stops, right? Everybody knows how to operate well within those SOGs. The issue comes in is when we get a fire that doesn't fit with the SOG. Then it's like we didn't prepare well for those situations that can happen. Again, the ceiling seemed to be SOGs, and then when something else happens, now we're at a loss. So that's kind of where we go back to experience and things like that. Hopefully, you have enough people on that run or that incident that have maybe seen that before and know what to do. That's the problem now, right? We're seeing is the runs are down, those kinds of experiences are down. So that would be the implicit knowledge, right? That kind of stuff is we're losing. So now it goes back to trying to insert that into our training. I want to go back and kind of touch on something that Scott said, and that's what's the end goal, right? Start with the end in mind, and then we can build our training program on that. And then as we work towards that successful end or what the outcome is supposed to look like, we need to build some successes inside there so our members understand, what, that's right. Like, Sam talked about pulling his Jeep across the floor. I guess he was making his guys fix his Jeep for him. Maybe as he's pulling the Jeep across, right, they saw success with what Sam taught them. And then they realized that, he knows these stuff. But then as he adds some of the off things, hey, look, guys, I had this one incident where we did this. And maybe it wasn't in the books written that way, but now they're going to be like, you know what, that works too. And now we need to listen to some of these other things we tell them. So does that kind of answer it? Yes, we were a very SOG driven fire department. And because of that, I think we saw where there was a ceiling to some of our officers and working with inside of that framework.
Tony, we got all that. The audio is really, really bad. I don't know what part of the country you're in right now, but it is what it is. But I think we got the gist of most of it. So I'm gonna flip that over back again to another chief. But I knew Dan as a driver and accompanying officer than I did as a chief, and obviously being intimately familiar with his organization. One, I know that how SOP driven they are currently. Even though we were definitely going down the right path in our careers together with a SOP-driven department. But piggybacking on what Tony Carroll just said, is that obviously Fairfax County is dealing with a youth explosion of officers. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, I mean, we've hired 500 people every year for the last 5 years, and that steady proliferation is not stopping as we continue to grow. I listen to all these guys, and it's such a great conversation. I go back to, and it's this quote that always resonates when we get in a conversation about learning styles or generational things. It's from Will Rogers. His quote was, there are three kinds of men: the one that learns by reading, the few that learn by observation, and the rest of them have to pee on the electric fence themselves. And so this is a guy who died in 1935. And the reason I share that is because, these are the generational things we've dealt with for eons. I'm sure every person on this panel could say that when they walked in the firehouse, they were probably told by some senior guy, told them, your generation sucks and you missed all the fires. And that continues even today. What do we say about the current generation is when they walk in the door is that, they're lazy and they want, and they ask too many questions. And then I look at my 15-year-old son and go, well, this country's been at war since he's been born. And no, it's not me fighting it. It's these youthful generations coming through the door. So I share that because I think the important part is that as an instructor, as a leader, or whatever you're doing, and I think Tony hit it on, and so did the rest of the guys, that you got to have the end goal, but you got to know your people. You got to know you might have 7 different learning styles with a blend of everything we're talking about within that classroom. And now the challenge for you is, how do you figure out to deliver the message? How do you get to the ultimate mission? Not, I got to check the box and finish this class, but how do I get to the ultimate mission to be able to get you to understand this? And so to your point, Ricky, kind of circling back, is whether you're an ops manual or operational manual or SOG or SOP driven fire department, many times what the point is, and this is one of the things I stress within our committee that does the manuals for the NOPA region, is we have a collective group in there. It's not one person's voice. And the idea is that they're legacy documents. They're training documents and they're operational documents. And the point is that you're trying to take all the knowledge base and things you learned over the years from going to these fires and collectively put it into some sort of doctrine that says, hey, here's a blueprint, a foundation for success on the fire ground. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do everything within here. You can't go outside those barriers, but if you do, you better know why. And you better understand that fires are dynamic. And when you go to a fire, you got to have some dynamic decision-making to go with it. So that's where you get to blend all that learning style back into it, is recognizing, yeah, I know what the manual says to me, but I'm not going to pull a pedestal out in the front yard and thumb to page 21 and say, hear ye, this is what we're going to do step by step. But you will remember, and I'll use our organizations in this region, is that if a unit marks on the scene says 2 in the front, 3 in the rear, walk out basement side, Charlie, fire in the basement, they cannot say another word. And I'm sure that when I would arrive on a fire ground, I know where those 3 hose lines have all went. One went to the fire, one is keeping the compartment into the basement, and the third is having dialogue to either go to an upper floor or to support that first line. And that doesn't happen by chance. It happens by those legacy documents, those SOGs, SOPs, or ops manuals that take what we've learned, incorporate it into a knowledge-based document that guides our doctrine on the fire ground. But then it's coupled with that intelligent small unit leader who shows up and recognizes the situation and goes, this applies. And now I can do it. So if they don't have the experience base, you hope they can glean some of that through the mentoring that happens in the firehouse. But I'll write your SOGs or SOPs or your ops manuals. Try to write them for that, that probie who comes into a firehouse and may have a lackluster, lazy captain or doesn't have a mentor, and they have a resource they can read that at least stimulates some questions that they can go find someone and say, hey, why does this say this? And when we talk about that modern generation, always ask the why. Well, if you can't explain the why, you probably don't know what it is. Now, if you ever explain it 10 times, that's problematic. But we should be able to explain the why, because I want you to learn this, and I want you to be better a company officer than I ever was. So, a lot of really great stuff shared by the rest of the panel about leading up to that, and those, we put terms with those learning styles. It's really important for us to be able to know who we're teaching to and what the point is and what the ultimate goal is.
All right, we're going to go back to Larry, but Chief Heller's glass distracted me. It looked like an awfully that was an awfully tall looking beer looking thing there. It's just water though. That was just vodka. One of two. So.
It's just water in a Sam Adams glass. After we're done, it'll get filled appropriately, I can tell you.
You're at home, buddy. You can drink anything you want, pal.
Yeah, exactly.
Chief Larry?
Yeah, so just to follow up on a couple things. One is Scott Kraut unknowingly provided a great example of implicit or tacit information knowledge. So Scott is one of those late 40, probably mid 40 type guys who looks like he's 25 years old. So I'm going to say he went to driving school about 10 years ago, and he sat in a classroom and he learned everything you need to know about driving his car. And when he first got behind the wheel, now I don't know this, but hanging around Ricky and Dan, when those two begin to tell stories about them and Scott Kraut at 410, I get an idea. I think I get an idea of how things were. But Scott goes through driving school, and he's learning every detail, and whether it's accelerating, braking, turning, figuring out how far to stay behind a vehicle. He's learning every bit of that, and that's explicit knowledge. Here he is 15 years later. He's driving down the road with his goatee, and he's listening to music. He's talking on the phone, and Scott is driving, and he's not even thinking about the steps that just 15 years ago he couldn't do a thing without thinking through it. So that's the difference between explicit and tacit knowledge. He does this, he does it without thinking. The good thing there for the firefighter, all that brain bandwidth to think about other things that he needs to think about. So that's number one. The other piece I wanted to talk about the SOGs, and I promise I'll make it quick, Rick. SOGs, not to get onto a different form of knowledge. SOGs are what's called heuristics. They're shortcuts. And there's a lot of benefits to shortcuts. Shortcuts allow us to predict how things might go, where we should put our lines, where we position the rigs, so on and so forth. And then, a good portion of our incidents, that's going to set us off in the right direction. Heuristics lose value in complexity. So when we pull up and we have real work to go to, and it's different than what we've seen, that's where we start to get ourselves in trouble with that just relying on explicit knowledge, right? Because Dan said this, and then I'll kind of quiet down here. Dan said, and this is an important piece. The problem with explicit knowledge is that we don't get the context, right? And fire departments, for a host of reasons, love to overuse explicit knowledge and put everything in writing. The problem is when the guys are sitting around, the firehouse and they're trying to read that information, they don't get Dan Shaw's context. They don't get the context of anybody on this show. And so they're left with just understanding what's written before them. And then when they pull up on that situation where it's just not making sense, they got nowhere to turn to. So the goal, and I hope we can touch this point before we have to roll off, is how do we capitalize and deliver in our departments throughout the fire service? How do we deliver training so that it has a reasonable dose of explicit information, greatly infused with the tacit or implicit knowledge of experienced firefighters?
Why you always got to ask a question like that? Say, hey, before I get to your question, I wrote something down while Larry was talking, and I want to get everybody's opinion on it. And I could be far from right by a far stretch, which it's happened before in my life. So, but I wrote down, listening to Dan, listening to Chief Carroll, and everybody, and talking about, as we shifted a little bit to the use of this knowledge with SOPs. I wrote down that SOPs put firefighters and officers in the right spot with the minimal knowledge to gain the experience to better handle the unexpected. Does that make any sense? That the SOP puts us in the right spots for the fire ground, and if we're in the right spots, we're going to gain that experience by being in the right spot rather than having been told, or am I off base totally?
No, I think that's probably a fair statement. Where I think it begins to lose some substance with it is if we don't quantify that's going to be for a reasonable average number of fires we go to, but there's going to be an equal number where the SOGs or where the firefighter is observing something that may not fit into it. And so when we don't teach them how to adapt, that's where the first piece becomes a problem. That's all.
All right. So why don't you re-at the question? I just, for some reason, that just got on me. But what was the question you wanted to ask the panel again, Larry? So I can go down the list.
statement was a good thought. I like I said, I just think with a piece of quantification. My question to the panel would be, moving forward, how do you see either yourself individually, your organization, this group, how do we find the balance, or what are the creative ways to move knowledge to the people listening, to the people in our organizations, where they're getting the right balance of explicit knowledge and intuitive knowledge? How do we train so that those two meet?
Okay, and I got the Brady Bunch look here on my screen, so I'm going to go down here to Chief Heller, who's next in line under Larry. So,
Well, I think that it's a little tricky depending on where you are and what you're doing. I think that one thing we've done to do a little bit better with that and to get them thinking on their own, I take it in two ways. On the fire side of things, my company operates as a squad, so they're doing a lot of tech rescue stuff, and that's one way. But on the fire side of things, we've done it with a little bit more of our props and with getting out into the field to lots of different buildings. So I think that's helped us take it from the SOP. This is what the SOP says. This is our POA or whatever it may be. And this is what we expect of you, to, oh crap, this is now what you're facing because this isn't exactly how the SOP was written around. So now you've got to deal with this. Now you've got to deal with the multiple cars parked in front of the shopping center. You've got to deal, with your aerial positioning or with your stretching through this or whatever. So I think that we're taking our explicit knowledge from the SOPs, SOGs, and whatever else you want to call it, our formal education, so to speak, and by better mock-ups, better props, better in the field hot training, we're doing a better job preparing them to think on their heels a little bit. And I feel that we're doing that same thing in companies with SOC training and things of that nature, because the props are getting better. And at least where I work, we've gotten more opportunity to do that. The other thing, and we've got a couple great training companies represented, along with the best hands-on training in the world with Fire Department Instructors Conference. I think you're seeing more of that mentality from our companies and a lot of the other little pop-up companies being shown on the training ground. And I think by doing that, we're creating, I wouldn't say necessarily free thinkers, but we're creating people who have that ability to adapt and overcome what they find, versus maybe what we were given when we first came into it. Because it was a little more strict and I think a bit more stringent when I came in than what we do with our firefighters now. We want them to think. I remember being told not to think, just do. So, I think that might be the difference, and that's kind of what I see.
as we go down the columns here, Scott Kraut's up next. We'll get back to Tony, Dan, and Sam here in a minute. So, Scott Kraut, I knew you wanted to chime in on this real quick after Chief Heller.
Yeah, I think Chief Heller's got a great point. And I think what organizations, to Chief Schultz's question, I think what organizations have to realize, and it sounds terrible to a certain extent, but you have to realize that there's going to be a gap, right? Like there's certain, like starting tomorrow, we are going to develop officers. I think all too often we get wrapped up in this thing of, well, what about these last 10 officers that they didn't go through this program? Well, that sucks, but that's just the way it's going to be this time, because we spend so much time trying to recapture or retrain the gap that's been missed that we never get caught up. And so for an organization or training department or a training division, you have to just say to yourself, we're going to start this tomorrow and have your plan together and then, hit the ground running, because like I said, we spend way too much time worried about what we missed. So that's the first point. The second point to that is there's a white paper written by some educational people, Binder and Boughton, and much smarter than I am. But they were doing research on a percentage-driven society, and one of the things that we've done in all aspects of life probably is we and it was to somebody mentioned this earlier, these assessment centers and whatnot. We've gone down this road of a percentage-based education system where passing the grade is over 70 or whatever, and as we know that's fine for maybe some things. I don't know. When I unravel it, it doesn't seem fine for anything. But what does that really tell you about an individual or organization if there's a 70 or 80% pass rate, and that's good enough, right? They passed the test. They got an 80 at passing. Put your costume on and go get some. And if you think about a language, so I try to train to fluency, which is both speed and accuracy. And if you think about fluency when you're talking about language or a composer or a musician, or they literally, as somebody was alluded to, they don't have to, or Chief Schultz alluded to this, they don't have to think about it. They're fluent in that said skill. And that comes with repetition, that comes with, perfect training. That if they miss a note or they miss a word, it just doesn't happen. It's like like you said, Chief, it's like driving or us having a conversation. I mean, we may stutter, but we typically jump right back to where we were. But so I think that's the goal, is understand there's going to be a gap, and then set your bar high. The fluency is the end goal, and then how do we get there? Well, you have to build a foundation. So just like with mathematics, and this is what that paper was talking about. If you don't learn how to add really well, and then you move on to algebra, well, you never had a foundation. So you're plopping one bad skill set on top of another until you get to a certain point where you have that 15-year individual who's just got this menagerie of skill sets that are not fluent in any of them. And so, as much as it hurts, it's not a no child left behind scenario, but as much as it hurts, you really have to make sure that our newest members are squared away, are fluent in whatever skill until they move on to the next. And one more thing is that, a lot of what we need to do is break down those skill sets that are emergent, the ones that we don't have time to discuss on the fire ground, and go, okay, well, what do we really need to be squared away at? Like these 10 items, we need to be fluent in running lines. We need to be fluent in forcing doors. We need to be fluent in our search. We need to be fluent in ladder work. We don't need to spend a bunch of time on lights and fans. Prioritize your topics, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because it's achievable. You can, as Sammy said, you can run a line all day long in the parking lot, and you can run that line in a garden apartment or a residential single family, and running around cars and trees and stop signs and everything else. You will be fluent, and then you get into judging distance and being able to make up a line. And so the goal for that particular topic is obviously fire extension, or at least keeping it in check. And so that's the end goal. How do we get there? Well, we get there by estimating line lengths. We get there by racking the appropriate racks that we're going to use, and we spend lots of time doing that. And if you think about children or pets, that we train or that we educate, we do that. Your kids don't learn how to eat with a fork overnight, but they do it, much like driving a car, and then they move on to the knife, So I think that's, those are the three key components: is understanding you're going to have a gap, prioritize your training, and Chief Heller's point, it's got to be realistic, and you have to have props, and you just got to keep throwing everything you can at those topics that are prioritized now, and crawl, walk, run, fly, until you get to fluency.
All right. Well, thank you for those thoughts there. I just want to I'm just got to get on to these other people, but it'll be, I'm going to hit to Sammy real quick, then Dan Shaw, then Tony. We're going to come back to you for your last piece on that before we head out. So if Sammy, if I remember correctly, and the only reason I came back to you is that I think that you wrote this up as an FDIC hot session was that we gave, I can remember we were standing backstage with Chief Halton, and everybody thought you were crazy when you said, hey, let's have people sign up for the hot classes. We'll give them homework leading up to getting out to Indianapolis, you know, so they get the background of why we're doing this, why we're doing that. And then when they come out here, then we'll put them through the practical session. Is that how I remember that, or?
Yeah, basically that comes down to one of the two things that I want to, or I think are important, the why. If we understand, if we're just told to do it and we become robotic, kind of like Chief Heller alluded to, then we're going to be able to perform in that particular situation. When we take time to understand the why and the concepts behind the statements or the practices, then we're able to adjust when we are encountered with something that we haven't seen before, because we understand the intent behind the tactic. The other thing is I really believe in successes and failures personally. To give you an example, we'll go back to the cars. You know, next time you're out there drilling on cutting up a car, have your rookies try to pull the line around a tire and then have them actually pull the line over the hood of the car. It won't take long for them to figure out which one they prefer. In fact, they'll figure it out really quick. It's kind of like touching a hot stove, right? The explicit part of that is at a certain degree, you're going to suffer a particular degree of thermal insult to your fingers, right? The implicit part of that is that was hot. I don't want to do it again. So I'm going to use an oven mitt next time. I don't know if I articulated that very well. So if I could try one more time, I'm basically saying, let them fail, let them try what doesn't work, and then have them try what does work immediately after, and they'll come to their own conclusion with mental memory of what they want to try to do on the fire ground.
So what I got is that I should touch the oven with an oven mitt. That's what I got out of that.
Yeah, but you got to
see my
their hand too.
Okay. I did that when I was younger, so
you did it once.
Yeah.
Well, maybe
I did
twice,
both hands.
I don't know.
So, Dan, and then we're going to Tony Carroll. So whatever, Tony, you need to stop whatever you're doing there. Look like you got in an accident there for a second. So, Dan.
So I mean, just to add on to the great stuff that the guys are saying already is, one is SOGs and operations manuals and SOPs, whatever you use, they are not an allowance for abdication of responsibility for you to teach the skill and the why behind everything you're doing. So don't rely upon, hey, I'm gonna put it in paper and I'm gonna walk away. It should be reinforced as these guys are talking about. So just because you wrote it down doesn't mean it's gospel. It's got to be reaffirmed and taught and learned. But it's 2020, right? So capitalize on the technology we have nowadays. I mean, the traditional means of simply giving you an IFSTA book and you read it and then we test you to a checklist, those days are gone. We try every day to figure out who's the audience we're trying to meet, and do they have a short attention span and they like 140 characters or less, and they like a short video. Okay. Am I going to get upset because I didn't learn that way? Or am I going to focus on, this is another avenue for me to get them to learn the why behind what we're doing? So I've written it down. We did a video demonstration of it, and then it's reinforced through the last part of it, which is the accountability, which is always missing in this part, right? We close the feedback loop and we have accountability for it. I know for us organizationally, what we try to do is we have this thing called ORS competencies, right? So every year, companies come back to the academy and they're graded on these basic fundamental skills for their unit they ride: the engine, a truck, a rescue, a tower, EMS unit. And they get a rating. And if they don't pass, they get remediated. And it gives some, credibility back to the training we're doing all the time, which is supporting that. And then we have the ability for that accountability. And when you talk about on the fire ground, that's where it's very important. We talked about this last night with Doug and I, is that, you can have great communications from the size up on scene report, lap, and command statement. But if you don't have some way to close out the incident, to bring all the companies together and say, we call it tailboard critique, but you don't have some means to bring your entire company officers back together and have immediate feedback to them to close out that loop, then they continue to do the work. And if they don't get any feedback, they're like, well, is it working? Is it not working? And we know the trade is full of bravado and no one walks around and says, hey, did I do a good job? But when people work hard, They like to be told, hey, that's working. And what I have found in my experience is the vast majority of people make acts of commission, not acts of omission. They're trying to do the right thing. Sometimes it's not, I may not understand why they did it, but very rarely is because they don't want to do any work. I want to show up to a fire and I'm not going to do a thing. So we got to give them that feedback. And more important, when you talk about accountability, people always go to the discipline side of it, right? I'm there to hold you accountable. Accountability means like, hey man, when you're doing something really well, I want to tell you doing it really well, and how do we keep that going? And what's the key for us to keep that going? And then these other company officers are hearing that, like, hey, we're in this tailboard critique. All the company officers, the chief is giving accolades for doing something good. How do I get to do that? Because ultimately, as firefighters, they're looking for that intrinsic reward. That intrinsic reward that says, hey, we have esprit de corps in our company. We love showing up to fires and things go well, and the chief can rely upon us. How do you build that? You have some measure of accountability. You close that feedback loop, and you give people really good information about when they're screwing up and how to fix it. And when they're doing it well, how do we keep that going?
All right. Thanks, Dan. It makes perfect good sense to me. It takes a lot for me to say that too, Tony Carroll, as long as you're not going to get in an accident, I guess we can.
The roads up here where I think I'm in New York now, they look pretty good. So we should be good for a little while. And I don't want to make it long. Can you hear me okay this time? I don't want to make it long, but because of the signal. But to go back to what Chief Schultz, I think what he asked is, how do we get this? How do we train our people in the implicit stuff, right? The implicit stuff, again, that's the written down. Then we need to get to the tacit thing. So I get it. We have to figure out a way. The problem is we can't we don't have a training grounds for every scenario that's out there. We also don't have an SOG for every scenario that's out there. But we just recently had a bus fire in a bus barn, right? We don't have an SOG for that. But we do have basics. We have companies that are set up to be the ones who bring water. We have companies who are set up to be the ones to ventilate the place, search, and that kind of thing. So now we can kind of build off of that, and hopefully it's going to get back to everybody on how it works. To kind of go back to what Dan said, the scaleboard critique is great for that immediate feedback to the companies that were there. The only other issue that I want to do is get it back to the people who weren't there. So we need to have good after action reports so we can get those things out to the people that weren't there, and that they can see what worked for those companies and what didn't. Because waiting for a fire to pop up to practice something on isn't good. And unfortunately, we don't have training grounds for everything. So I think it's from a chief standpoint, it's my responsibility to get out there and invest in the members and say, look, there was a fire even if I find a fire in Fairfax or a fire in Wichita, that this is what happened. This is what the guys did. We can apply that to something in Washington, D.C., and maybe plan, all right, if we have a fire like this the next week, these are the things that I would hope you would do and build off of what we already have in place. But again, there's so many different things that we have to be prepared for. And, perhaps it's a company that only goes to fires in 2-story roads. They're bound to get a fire in a bus in a warehouse eventually. So we need to get the message to them. But again, maybe we can't set that scenario up our training ground and pretend, all right, this box this box over here is a bus. It's inside of a building. What are you going to use to attack it? And perhaps you can do that. But I think it's incumbent on the company officer that he pays attention to what's going on outside of his company in the fire service, can get that information back to his people, and it's incumbent on chief officers to do the same thing. So hopefully,
well, I think we're losing Tony.
we can tell them about what's going on and how they can do it. Again, we don't have all the experience. We don't have all the experience. So we can give
I think we lost Tony. So
He's frozen in time.
yeah, he's frozen in time. So hey, we're getting down to those last minutes of the conversation here today, and I just want to kind of run around the table real quick. If Tony comes back,
that's
then
all I got.
he muted himself this time. So Tony's trying to do family stuff and take care of fire engineering all in the same day. So I guess we'll start, once again at our little Brady Bunch thing here. And we'll start with Chief Schultz. You got some closing thoughts here? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Rick, thanks again for doing a great job facilitating this one. This is one that we could go on for days about. So keeping us on track and keeping everybody moving is probably the hardest part of the job for sure. So my 2 cents on how we do this. I kind of teed that question up because I knew Danny Shaw was going to jump on it. So I had the pleasure of working with Danny for about 3.5 years over in Northern Virginia. And there wasn't many days. Now, he was one of those 8-day-a-week guys or 8 days a month guy. But there weren't many of those that him and I didn't talk about incidents that our two collective jurisdictions went to collectively. And I loved it because I think I held Danny accountable to make sure that issues were addressed that occurred in my jurisdiction, and Danny would call up and say, hey, we got to do better on this from incidents we had in his jurisdiction. We didn't mince words, we didn't hurt feelings, but we were both incredibly passionate about saying it was up to him and I to go out and have those uncomfortable conversations, and to do it not in a way that embarrassed anybody, humiliated anybody, but to go out and have a 10-minute conversation on the fire ground as a teaching moment. And I shared this with my battalion chiefs over the past week. If every one of us goes out to the scene, even if it's a know-nothing fire, and we take 5 or 10 minutes to pass on experience to the explicit knowledge, in other words, to provide context to the written knowledge, then everybody walks away from that incident significantly better. 10-minute investment. I guarantee you, every officer, every company officer, every chief out there, if you will do that every time you have an opportunity, 5 or 10 minutes, infuse that intuitive or that implicit knowledge into the explicit knowledge, and provide context to what the written document says, everybody's organization grows exponentially day by day. So thanks to fire engineering, thanks to Sam Hiddle for bringing this up. And I just want to know who Marsha Brady is on the show here. You're on mute, Rick.
I would say that I would be Sam Hiddle or it's Cindy Brady. So I don't know. He was falling asleep, so I got to go out of sequence now. So I want to go to him so he doesn't fall asleep. I can get to Aaron and Dan and Scott. So if you can stay awake with us, Sammy.
I would just say something that Scott Kraut hit on briefly, and I don't know if many caught it, but there's an unlearning component that goes with this. We keep talking about how intuitive the tacit knowledge is. And so the unlearning piece of that, when bad tactics have been taught or bad practices have been instilled in our members, is another very difficult and complex training component to tackle. I would encourage you to look at Stanford. They've done a tremendous amount of studies on the unlearning process, and Harvard Business Review also puts out some very good documents on how to reverse bad thinking.
All right. And Chief Heller?
I think everything we went over, this is a great topic and needs to be covered by more people in more places. Just as Chief Schultz said, I had a couple jobs in the last couple of weeks with my guys, and they did really well. They knocked it out of the park, so to speak. But there were still things that could have been done better. I've never gone to a call that I thought went exactly as it could or should. So I stopped at those firehouses and we just had a little coffee table talk, socially distanced, of course, you know, but we just had a little talk and we reviewed a couple things and, hey, maybe we could have done that. And it didn't have to go to SOP. It didn't have to go to anything further. And it did go to what we knew worked. And it really was more of the tacit. And that sort of thing needs to happen really every call, every run. When you get back, just have that little discussion and where does it all play out? And I agree. And part of it was, as Sam just said, part of it was some bad habits learned from really a bad company officer who's no longer there. So I appreciate this topic. Appreciate being with you guys, and just want everybody to stay safe, man. Let's do this so we can stay safe and be around together.
All right, thank you, Chief. Scott Crowd, are you done with the bathroom?
I am.
Okay,
Can you
good.
hear me?
Congratulations. Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you. Everything went well. Appreciate it. Yeah, I think you know, all the things we talked about are great, and again, the opportunity afforded to us by fire engineering is amazing. But I guess to close, I would just Chief Schultz and Chief Shaw's conversation about having those discussions, regardless of how hard they are, is a must. I mean, and then the flip side of that is, as a company officer, I have to have thick enough skin to accept that criticism. And in fact, I long for it. You know, I really, you know, hope to be held accountable by all my bosses, because, you know, the things that I've learned, that knowledge came from making mistakes and came from trying to be the best company on the fire ground, time and again. You know, just never wanting to be, as Chief Heller said, to walk away from an incident and go, oh yeah, I got this. You know, no problem. Everything went great. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And so, you know, from an organizational standpoint, I think that needs to be a common discussion. You know, we in Fairfax, we still, you know, have big fires and we talk about them the next morning, and it's, you know, sometimes it's, you know, they did a great job. Well, you know, no, they didn't. So, you know, and that's not a negative. It's, you know, we could have done better. We could have kept it to one row home. We could have kept it to the second floor. And I would hope that any company officer is okay with that conversation. Nothing has to be punitive, you know, but there's no QI, if you will, when it comes to firefighting. It's, you know, EMS does it really well, and we need to adopt that piece that says, you know, whether it's recertified or retrained or just the 10-minute discussion afterwards of, well, what could we have done better, I think is super important. So from Chief's perspective, I'd beg the criticism, and from a company officer's perspective, I would welcome it. So thanks again.
No problem, Scott. Dan, do you want to tell everybody about all the counseling I had to do with Scott when I was Scott's driver, or do you?
I find it a pleasure. I got to drive Scott to his first working fire as a company officer. There's very few things I can notch down that I'm more proud of.
I'm just going back to last night's photo of that fire you had of us in Arlington, and I had to tell Scott, just put the map book away. I'll get us there.
Yeah, Tom's forgotten. Let's hope.
Oh, come on. I was stressed out.
They'll be fine. Anyway, to your point, Ricky, I think, you know, one, echoing what everyone else in here said, thanks again to Fire Engineering, Bobby, and the group. Just always a great pleasure to have this platform to share information. And I think that really goes to the heart of what we're talking about, is that it's a privilege to be an instructor, a trainer, to be in a leadership position, because you get to impact other people and you get to cultivate them to what you think the fire service should be. And, you know, if you come into this job in a servant leadership capacity, you want to make them better than you are. So when they're in this role, they can execute the mission even better. So it really comes down to, one, you know your people, you know the people you're training, you know their capabilities, limitations, and you know how to reach them. But you know your mission. You make that commander's intent very clear. Are you focused as someone who's teaching about whether you're right and you're going to jam it down their throats, or how can I get you to learn this and be able to do this? And that's what we really want to focus on. And I think Sammy kind of touched on this, and we talked about this last night too, is that, hey, you can get to that 10,000 hours, the mystical 10,000 hours of instructor-led portion to get to the mastery. But we also know that if you don't do those skills, it's not like you get to 10,000 hours and then you can stop. The minute you stop doing a skill, you start to lose it. And so it's a continual process that we talked about last night with mastery, is that, mastery is that constant seeking to get to the top, to get to the pinnacle of your skill set. Doesn't mean you got there. You keep going. As soon as you get to the top of that first mountain, the clouds part, there's another one to get to. And you keep working and working it to get to that part. And that last part is when we talk about that, is that, that you got to have the feedback. You got to be honest enough that you have an incident or a training session that you tell people who are putting effort forth that this is working and not working, but you're honest and you're candid with them. And you're doing that so you can improve them, not to boost your own ego. And you're giving them good information. And fortunately, or hopefully over time, you start to see is that, all these parts come together for us to execute the mission really well. So always a pleasure to talk with you guys and see you.
Tony, we're going to give you another shot here.
Hi, how's that? Hopefully you can hear me. I appreciate you guys letting me be a part of this. I hope whoever was watching this, gained some knowledge, got something out of it. I know I get something out of it every month when I get to talk to you guys and listen to what you have to offer. I think that as officers, as administration, as leaders in the fire department, we have a duty to provide feedback to our members, good, bad, and different. Same thing. I expect feedback from above me, so I'm going to do the same thing for my members, and it's important. So thank you.
All right. Be safe driving. Don't veer off the road. All right, so we're kind of at the end of our time, and I got to wrap it up here for fire engineering. Once again, thanks to Chief Bobby Halden and Fire Engineering for allowing Traditions Training in the International Society of Fire Service Instructors to be able to put this together. Obviously, we have a great mix here together, and it does really well. I will say that I've been looking at Twitter and some of the social media stuff. A lot of the comments made by my esteemed colleagues, Bill Carey, who works for Fire Engineering, has been putting up on Twitter. So some of the quotes today from some of the great things that were said today by my friends are up there. So take a look at that on Twitter. And other than that, I think we're going to call it quits here for the day. I think everybody did a great job. I greatly appreciate you taking your time out of your busy days in your fire departments during this pandemic to be able to help us instruct our firefighters and out there in the field. So I appreciate your time, and I'm sure Fire Engineering does also. So, well, we're signing off here from Fire Engineering. Have a great day.